Let's talk a little big picture. So when you talk to recruits, how much does winning down the stretch, the end of last year, help the way that kids viewed UF overall? We talked about what happened to this class at the very beginning of the season, and they really did do such a 180 towards the second half. Does that make a huge difference to them?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think too, when at Under Armour week, so it's only a few months after the season. That's the thing compared to last Under Armour and then this one, you kind of saw a lot of kids being way more optimistic. Obviously, knowing that Billy Napier was coming back for another season was a big thing. But when you talk to kids last year, before last season, there was kind of a pause with Florida, just knowing like, hey, they have to win. So it's kind of a wait and see. Let me see how they play. Now I think the way they finished and how Florida finished out with that, I think there's a lot more optimism, a lot more big kids. Obviously, we talked about Manny and Hacho, the five-star offensive tackle from Maryland. He's a classic example where at Under Armour, he kind of said, hey, I wasn't really looking at Florida too much until the way they beat LSU and Ole Miss. And then obviously the Florida State game as well. So I think the way they finished was huge. And even like the 25 class, I mean, Laganza Hayward's one that comes to mind, who obviously decommitted from Tennessee late down the stretch. He said when he attended the Tennessee-Florida game, he's like, man, even though Florida lost, they're a lot better than I thought they would be. And then obviously they started piling up the wins and stuff like that. Another classic example too is Jaden Woods, a guy I'm very high on, the edge they flipped from Penn State.
Yeah.
He visited early in the year, and then he committed to Penn State. But Florida, he said he always loved Florida, but he just wasn't sure if they were going to win. That was his big thing. He came for a late season OV, I believe it was for the Ole Miss game, or LSU or Ole Miss, one of the two. And after that, he committed not long after. He just needed that one visit to kind of see Florida winning in person. So you look at the way Florida finished. Yeah, NIL is a big thing, but Florida's usually competitive in NIL no matter what. Depending, they're always near the top when it comes to a kid. It might be the best NIL offer or pretty close to it. But then obviously the wins were huge. If Florida didn't finish the way they did in the field, this class probably would have been the 20s and 30s. I mean, it was just constant momentum, one after another. And then, Tramel Jones, obviously, I think that was the big spark with them when they got that quarterback in the class. And then a lot of dominoes started falling after that.
So that was what I was going to ask you about next, was NIL and how much UF's NIL plays into their success. So essentially what you're saying is Florida's NIL house is fully in order, but that wasn't the difference with this past class. It was the wins on the field.
Yeah, I think so for sure. I mean, because even like Hilton Stubbs, I mean, that was never. He's a guy, obviously, that Florida was in the hunt for all last year. They were so close to getting him a few other times early in the year. And NIL really was an issue. Miami obviously is always near the top two with NIL. And there was word that Miami still had a better NIL offer than Florida at the time. But obviously having Tramel Jones in the fold, the way Florida was winning towards the end, that was a big factor with him. I think Ty Jackson's another one, the linebacker. Distance from home was a big thing with him as he got down the stretch. Remember, he was committed to USC for a while. But, Florida, he was another one that was in attendance for the Ole Miss game. So being around that atmosphere and actually seeing Florida turn it around. And once they announced Billy Napier, too, that was another big thing. Once they announced that Billy Napier was returning, that was such a big. Florida had to make an announcement one way or another. That's what was kind of holding them back. I think people were like, hey, it's getting late in the cycle, and I like Florida, but are they going to keep Billy? And then once they announced that, and then it could have went better for Florida. Then they started winning even more. Right. It just, everything came together as a dream scenario for them. But yeah, I think obviously Jaden Woods, Ty Jackson, Laganza Hayward, Hilton Stubbs. You also got to look at the FSU situation too. Daniel Pierre-Louis, who was committed to FSU. Obviously Florida, when they offered him, they didn't really turn the corner yet late in the season, but FSU was kind of turning down one way, and Florida was kind of right there with it. Then once Florida started winning, they got him on board. Same thing with Tramel Jones. He grew up a big Florida fan, and I don't think a lot of people realize, too, his dad graduated from Florida. He didn't really mention that early on in the recruiting. But his dad, he always loved Florida, but he wasn't sure if they were going to win. And, once it started happening, everything kind of turned for him.
What's the mood from recruits around some of the coaching changes that UF has made this offseason? I'll get right back to the video. But first, I appreciate BetUS for all their support. Just quickly, make sure you are betting with them and use their code YouTube150. That'll get you a 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit. And you'll also get 125% on your next 2 deposits, all up to $2,000. I appreciate BetUS for their support.
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind, like Vinny Sunseri. I know Caden Hall's one kid out of Milton High School, one of their top safeties on the board, top 50 kid overall. Florida's always been near the top for him. He's one kid that comes to mind right away just because when they hired Sinceri, he even said, "Hey, he recruited me. He was at Washington. I probably wasn't going to go to Washington, but they're always in my top group just because of their relationship." And then, I think adding him on, especially with Will Harris gone, I think right now with DB, it's going to be interesting because the Florida's in a good spot for a lot of different DBs. Now I think there's going to be a little bit of a pause just to kind of obviously with those relationships need to start getting built again. But having Vinny come on board, I think that helps with some of the kids like a Caden Hall who really liked him at Washington. But then when he went to Florida, I kind of put an article recently that could have kind of put Florida in the driver's seat for him because even for a year and a half, he would always say Florida's the top 3, top 4 for me. And then it was kind of around the time when Florida wasn't winning as much. Then Florida wins, and then Will Harris is there. Now he leaves, but now with Vinny Sunseri there, he's actually the safeties coach. That might save Florida a little bit as far as where they stand with him. But I think right now, when it kind of looks at when it comes to recruiting with that, I think it's kind of a pause, kind of a wait and see. Like Brody Jennings is another one. He's a Michigan commit, Jacksonville Mandarin, so he's a former teammate with Hilton Stubbs and Tramel Jones. He's always been a realistic flip guy. He's obviously a strong commit to Michigan, but Florida's really had the full court press on him for a while now. Napier, Will Harris at the time, they were really going all in for him. And I kind of said that I thought Florida had the best chance of flipping him. But now, obviously, with Will Harris, not on the staff, then you kind of keep, I'm sure on his camp, they're probably hitting pause a little bit. You saw Miami after him, Florida State. So I think with DB recruiting, that's when we're going to see a little bit of a pause when it comes to these kids. And, but like I said, thankfully for Florida, this is early in the cycle and, time's on their side when it comes to that.
Yeah, they do have time, and that makes perfect sense, right? You got to kind of feel out these new coaches. But do you have any kind of sense of the type of recruiters that Bala and Wilson, and obviously you like what you've heard so far about Sinceri, what kind of recruiters they're going to be once these players do get to know them?
Yeah, because with Wilson, he was on the staff before, and I know when he was recruiting a lot of guys as assistant. Corey Raymond was here. He was a guy that was actively recruiting a guy that a lot of DB recruits would actually bring up at the time. Obviously Corey. I would say you had the Corey Raymond effect. He sold stuff for himself. I mean, his name would get a lot of kids in the door. Yeah, they would get a lot of kids in the door. But when it came to kind of putting the groundwork behind the scenes, Wilson, Darren Wilson was a guy that a lot of recruits mentioned. So. I think since he left Florida, I'm sure he's got even more of a better recruiter. He was at Arkansas, so he's recruiting a lot of SEC level guys. But from everything I've heard from people, close to him, they said the guy's relentless. That was a word that someone told me when it comes to recruiting. So I think you can almost make an argument Will Harris probably outperformed Corey Raymond in recruiting at Florida just during the Florida stay. You can almost make the argument. You had like Jakeem Jackson, some guys that got on board early on, but Will Harris did a good job this past cycle. They really knocked out of the park late in the cycle. And the vibe is that Florida feels confident they're not really going to drop off too much with Darren Wilson. They think Florida, the brand's going to sell itself, and you're going to get a lot of kids on the board, just after last season. But then obviously having a younger guy who people have said relentless, a guy that really gets on the recruiting trail, really calls a lot of kids. I don't think you're going to see too much of a drop off. Obviously, it's a wait and see, but the vibe is around the program from people I've spoken to that they're pretty confident that Darren Wilson's a guy that's really going to do a good job at Florida, and that's why you kind of look at when they made the hire. It didn't take too long for them to make that hire. I think it's a guy they had in their back pocket, thinking if something ever happened, he's going to be like a next man up, a guy we can bring in.
Well, Gator fans will be very happy to hear that for sure.